Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today for today's Global Hotspots talk. Global Hotspots is a partnership of the UW-Madison Division for International Studies, Plato, and the Wisconsin Alumni Association. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce you to a fantastic group of UW experts here on our campus. Today, we're going to hear about what's happening in Russia, what's been happening for the last year, and what we might expect moving forward. Right now, I'd like to introduce you to Professor Ted Gerber. Please join me in welcoming Ted Gerber.
Thank you very much. So is this mic going to pick? Okay, yeah, I can hear myself. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to see so many of you out here today. I think the topic is indeed of considerable topical interest, as we say. If you read the news, and I presume that most of you do, otherwise you probably wouldn't be here at this event, then you know that relations between the United States and Russia are extremely tense recently, mainly as a result of Russia's incursions into Ukraine. Many commentators in the media and politicians, academics who follow Russia have argued that the recent tensions have reached such a height that we're essentially in a new phase of a new Cold War. And they say that Russia has changed substantially from the Russia that existed a year ago, that it's become much more anti-American, much more aggressive in its foreign policy, much more nationalistic, xenophobic, and that not only is the Russian government aggressively pursuing actions which threaten world stability, but the Russian population itself supports these measures. However, there's a dissenting view according to which actually it's mainly the government that's driving this, and society, although it may be fearful of the government, it may be concerned, it's not really behind this. The purpose of today's panel is to discuss this question. Is Russia a different Russia today than it was 1 year ago? And if so, or if not, what are the likely consequences for Russia, for global stability, and for the United States? We are very fortunate to have three distinguished, world-renowned researchers who are, all three of whom are here at the UW campus, who will address this question. Farthest to my left is Professor David McDonald of the History Department. In the middle, we have Professor Irina Shevelenko from the Slavic Department. And to my immediate left is Professor Yoshiko Herrera from the Political Science Department. So we have three different disciplinary perspectives, three different departments. And I've asked each of the panelists to begin with a 5-minute or so statement about how they understand the question, how they would answer the question, is Russia today a different Russia than Russia was 1 year ago? And if so, if not, what are the likely larger consequences? So why don't we start from the historical perspective, and I'll turn the floor over then to Professor McDonald.
Okay, thank you, Ted. Very quickly to begin, but before I begin the substance of the talk, I can't help remarking that in terms of the status of the university, which interests us all, that if we ran the university according to the way that we're often told we should, about 10 years ago, none of us would have had a job. That Russia was a spent force who needed to know anything about Russia. It might have had some sort of cultural interest or some sort of abstract interest, but after all, what does it have to do with anything? I think it's an important thing to remember that we never can tell what's going to happen. Whether some compound that was thrown away is going to be the next cure for the next generation of antibiotics, as penicillin was the first. There's all sorts of things that happen on campuses that nobody can predict where they're going to go, and I think this panel is, at least in terms of the humanities and social sciences, an excellent example of the long-term bets that universities make that also pay off for society. Now, while we're on the subject of paying off for society, how's it going for President Putin? Well, I think to answer Ted's basic question, is Russia different now than it was a year ago? I think if you went there as a visitor, you'd get very distinct impressions. On the street, you would notice maybe more people wearing the St. George's ribbon. It's a decoration that was handed out to people who participated in World War II. Orange and black itself, it was a recapitulation of a very prestigious order under the Tsars in the imperial period. Certainly if you watch television, you would think that Russia was a very different place. That's one place that it's different, is television and a lot of the media that you would normally consume are very much more univocal. They're very much more consistent in the message they're giving. And I'd say the biggest difference between now and a year ago is we're seeing a society that is much more mobilized than it was before. And mobilized around something we didn't really take into account, and we haven't taken into account since 1991. One starting point to think of is we thought in 1991 the Cold War had ended with very decisive winners and losers. As somebody had told us at the time, this was the quote-unquote end of history, right? There were going to be no more ideological conflicts. There were going to be no more clashes. The Soviets had come to see the error of their ways. A few more McDonald's, a Burger King here and there, Dunlop tires, and they would finally embark on the road to modernity that they had missed at critical junctures through the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Nobody told the Russians that they lost. Indeed, we never took into account what that experience was from 1991 until the first decade, well into the first decade of the 21st century, when oil prices rallied and the economy came back together. This was a period of continued and accumulating traumas, right? From your social and economic private circumstances, what school your kid was going to go to, what your professional prospects were, especially if you're somebody above the age of 30 in 1991, your savings, which would have evaporated overnight. You're having to reconceptualize what property was, what your apartment was, what type of legal setting it operated in, the emergence of all these troubling signs of a crumbling order, domestically apparently rising crime because now they could report it, the emergence of the mafia that we all talked about in the 90s and later the new Russians, the oligarchs, this huge and visible disparity of wealth that was emerging in the place, plus looking abroad, a successive series of humiliations. And again, we've heard President Putin retail this story very effectively. Promises that you thought had been made by the United States and NATO seemed, to your point of view, to have been repeatedly broken. Borders that you had never really thought about, say you had family in Kiev or in Crimea or in the Caucasus, all of a sudden you had to show passports and go through a series of crossings or experience borders that you'd always considered notional, not real. And through it all, you got a sense that your country, which had once been a superpower, so you believe, on a par with the United States, was now being treated as a second-rate power. And nothing symbolized it so much as the second term of Boris Yeltsin, right, where he, for reasons that we know and probably others we don't acknowledge, became the embodiment of incompetence and dissipation, much as his predecessors Brezhnev and Chernenko had been under the late Soviet order. And the one thing Putin has done, well, he's done two things, I'll put it this way. First, he has found a way to articulate and talk to this broad swath of post-Soviet society, and it is in many ways still a very post-Soviet society in terms of its political rhetoric and conduct. He has found a way to talk to and mobilize that base. He probably doesn't enjoy the support that the polls suggest he does, but he certainly enjoys a degree of support that would be the envy of an Obama or a McConnell or any aspiring candidate for national office in this country. And he's done it by appealing to this gathering sense of resentment, but also by mobilizing the memory of the Great War of the Fatherland as a moment that his society can now emulate vis-a-vis the West. That's the short answer. I'll throw it to the next person.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor McDonald. And just so the Great War of the Fatherland, just for those who don't say Russian, that's what the Russians call the Second World War.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a very nice introduction by way of the sort of history of the post-Soviet era. And that lays the stage nicely for my colleague, Professor Herrera, who I hope will address the current political situation in more detail.
Yes, thanks very much, and thanks for organizing this panel. I think it's unfortunately for me, I feel in 2014, each time I've given a talk on current events in Russia, it becomes a little bit more negative. But nevertheless, having thought about it quite a bit, there's really no other way to answer the question of, is this a different Russia than it was 1 year ago? Yes, it's a different Russia, and let me lay out some of the ways. Number one, the economy is in serious decline. The ruble has fallen at various points last week up to 50%, lost 50% of its value since the beginning of 2014. There's no way to say that's not a problem. That's a problem. The price of oil is low. It's hovering around $80 a barrel, which is a price at which President Putin said would be catastrophic, not only for Russia, but for other countries. There aren't signs that in the very short term the price of oil is going to go back up. The sanctions by the United States and the European Union are very serious. In Russia, on the media, on TV, they try to downplay this, but make no mistake about it. Even though the sanctions are very complicated and very poorly understood, both in the West and in Russia, the sanctions are having a serious effect. It's causing a serious problem of capital for banks and large businesses in Russia, which is adding to the larger financial crisis. More importantly, what has been a traditional, if we can say traditional, or recurrent problem with economic growth in Russia, it's been a lack of confidence in the government in managing the economy. That has only become even more of a problem, even more evident, and there is a severe lack of trust in the investment climate. Who is ready to start a business today in Russia? Who is thinking about any kind of long-term agreement, which is what you need for long-term economic growth? So there's a lot of uncertainty, but what we do know is quite negative. Are property rights going to be protected? No. Is rule of law improving? No. Will there be a financial crisis? Almost certainly. I mean, at this point, the debate in Russia among the best economists and the smartest people, they're debating whether they can convince the government to not intervene in the currency markets and to just let the ruble fall rather than pursuing a failed strategy of propping up the currency, because they see all the other signs and they see that they're very unlikely to win against speculators. Okay, that's the economy. On the social side, fear and political persecution are on the rise. There's politicization of the criminal justice system. We just had a talk on that yesterday here on campus. People are afraid to act collectively. They are afraid to speak out, which leads us to be a little bit skeptical about the apparent level of support of Putin, because I think this is the kind of thing that you can see crumble very quickly once other people start realizing where the true level of support is. But that's not to say that there isn't actually some level of support for Putin, some level of support for the return of Crimea to Russia, etc. I'm just saying that on this front, because we know that fear and political persecution are on the rise, the true level of support for the regime may be a little bit lower than is apparent. Most important, however, is that I think there is now tremendous uncertainty about the limits, if any, on predatory government action, including violence. If we were in this room 1 year ago today and somebody said, what do you think is the probability of an invasion of Estonia? It would not even be a question that would be asked. There probably would be zero. Even if we asked 1 year ago, what is the probability of an invasion of Ukraine? Again, we would say, why are you even talking about that? That is a crazy question. Nowadays, things that had been unthinkable 1 year ago are no longer unthinkable. We can ask, is the probability of an invasion into other Eastern European states high? No, it's not high, but it's not zero anymore. And if those things are on the table, you ask, what are the limits on the Putin government? What are the limits? What is stopping him from acting? Is it international legitimacy? Is it domestic support? What are the limits? And you see that those limits are very, very weak. He obviously doesn't care about international legitimacy, and the amount of domestic pressure on the regime is extremely low. So we could step back and say, yes, okay, NATO probably still is a deterrent. But if we're in a world in which NATO is a deterrent, and that's the limit that we can think of as a reasonable limit, that is a serious situation for U.S.-Russian relations, for Russian-European relations, and for the world. Okay, so what can we expect? With the declining economy and other factors, we will expect more scapegoating internally, targeting foreign companies, targeting foreign governments, foreign citizens, NGOs, etc. I think this is a no-brainer. This is a relentless campaign on TV against enemies of Russia, and I think we can expect more of that. Even things, again, that would have been totally crazy a year ago, like exit visas. I think we could ask, would there be exit visas? There might be. They might reinstitute exit visas for some people. More populism? Yes, we expect the government to do that, but how is that going to work? How long is populism going to work when the economy is falling? And hence that gets us to the aggressive military action abroad that people see as something to compensate for the weak position domestically. And so, what would we expect, what would you think about fuller or more extensive military action in Ukraine? And there, I think, throughout 2014, since the taking of Crimea, it looked like in May they were on the verge of a fuller scale invasion of Ukraine. That was stepped back a little bit in conjunction with sanctions, but I would say with a declining economy and some other factors, we couldn't rule out an invasion of Ukraine. That looks like the most likely scenario. People have brought up Kazakhstan, the Baltics, etc., and I think where the interests in Russia lie are in southern and eastern Ukraine. Okay, so what can be done about that? I want to note that on the media, on TV and in newspapers, people talk about building trust. How can U.S.-Russian relations be improved? How can trust be rebuilt? A fundamental insight from what we know about trust is that you cannot build trust with someone who is untrustworthy. So if somebody is out to get you, the question is not about building trust. It's about protecting yourself from that kind of aggression. Russia under Vladimir Putin is a wolf in wolf's clothing. So to fix things, you don't, and that's, let me just give my colleague and husband, Andrew Kidd, credit. He has an article called Sheep in Sheep's Clothing, which was about rebuilding trust after the Cold War. And it's about signaling and how if you're actually trustworthy, there's various things you can do, like Gorbachev did with nuclear arms reductions, moving out of Eastern Europe, et cetera. There are things that you can signal to signal your true intentions. But if your true intentions are actually aggressive, then this is not a question of building trust. This is a question, and here I'm going to quote a prominent economist in Russia, Konstantin Sonin. On his most recent blog, he quoted the Count of Monte Cristo, and he said, what we have to do is wait and hope. Wait because, now this is also telling of the political environment at the time. Even though he's a prominent economist, he writes an article, monthly column for a major newspaper there. Even he cannot say, the problem is the government has done this, that, and the other thing wrong. What he has to say is very, very specific. He says we have to wait for a radical change in the political situation that will make economic problems the focus of the government. So not even blaming the government, but say we have to wait, and this is about the ruble crisis, say we have to wait for the government to get around to focusing on the economy, and we have to hope that it will happen soon.
Well, thank you very much for that clear and dire picture. So now we turn, last but of course not least, to Professor Shevelenko, who will tell us from her perspective whether Russia has changed in the last year.
Thank you very much, Yoe and David, I'm sorry, for their perspectives. And I must say that I agree with both. Moreover, I can say that in the past half a year, I have been following Russian media, well, those which are not official, and I have been following Western media, and dozens of approaches to analyzing this situation were offered in those analyses. And I must say, I could say about most of them, I agree with this perspective, although many of those perspectives were offering very different explanatory models. And I believe we are in that point in history, at least in the history of Russia, but maybe in the history of Europe, where no one can really know what happens next. As a literary scholar, usually every fall I teach a course on Tolstoy. And in particular, I teach War and Peace. And in War and Peace, those of you who have read it, Tolstoy devotes many pages to discussing how history, in fact, is unpredictable. And it is unpredictable because there are so many different forces involved. You cannot account for them. You cannot possibly know who will be the decisive agent, who will kind of help or who will help resolve the situation. And well, usually readers of Tolstoy do not agree with him and say, no, that's not true. Tolstoy's argument is that always, when you're looking backwards, you can explain everything very logically. But when you are in a moment in history, if you were in 1811, he's talking about Napoleonic Wars, and if in 1811 you would be told that it will be a Russian empire that would stop Napoleon in his ambitions, people wouldn't take you seriously. So, why I'm talking about that? It's because I do believe that a year from today, we may look at our today's discussion in disbelief about what issues we thought were critical. When I look back, I belong to a generation that was close to graduation from college, or actually I graduated from college in 1991 when the Soviet Union disappeared from the map. And I must tell you, even 1 year before that happened, even half a year before that happened, even a month before this crisis in August 91 that preceded the dissolution of the Soviet Union, no one could have thought about how this would happen. No one in particular could have thought that this could happen peacefully. But it happened almost peaceful at that time. As a literary scholar as well, I'm not a poli-sci person, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a historian, although I'm trying to be. I also believe that the situation as it has been unfolding in the last year, and in fact, as it has been unfolding in the last 3 years, because this crisis is rooted in September 2011, and I may go into more details why it is so. It has been unfolding so quickly. And when we look at Putin, and we kind of have sometimes a feeling that he is the person who controls the situation. I believe this is an impression he wants to project, but it's not true. In August this year, he or someone in his near circle had to make this very sudden and very quick decision to interfere with specifically with military actions in eastern Ukraine more actively in order to save the situation here, because the Ukrainian army was about to regain control over all those territories. And apparently there was a lot of internal struggle in his circle to allow that happening or not allow that happening. At that moment, a certain group won. We don't know what happens tomorrow. I mean, all news are very gloomy now. And just this morning, I read this new piece of news about this last independent Russian radio station that apparently a week from today, there will be a meeting, an unexpected meeting of the board. This is Echo Moskvy, so for the Echo of Moscow. For those who follow Russian news, this is one of the most reliable sources, besides a couple of internet sites. Just today, they announced this board of directors, the meeting of the board of directors next Friday, which will consider 3 questions: the appointment of the director of the station, the general editorial policy, and the general format of the radio station. So they may all of a sudden turn it from a kind of news, political radio station into, I don't know, music radio station. So all news are bad, but it looks like the situation unfolds so quickly that no one person can, in fact, hope to have privileged agency in controlling this situation. In fact, people on the ground, and one of the things I wanted to mention now, because we spoke very little about Ukraine and what's actually happening here. But frankly, what is happening now in eastern Ukraine is a civil war. It's a war between Russians and Russians. It's not a war between Ukrainian army versus local guerrilla. It's a war of local guerrilla against the population. It's a war of local guerrilla who are Russians, most of them ethnically Russians. Some of them are from Russia, some of them are from Ukraine, but they identify themselves as Russian, against others, against also the soldiers in the Ukrainian army who also, half of them, are ethnically Russians. And that sets a very dangerous model for what can then unfold in other parts of Russia once economic crisis is fully there. We can see emergence of various kind of guerrilla resistances in different parts of country, clashes between local administration and some other adventurous paramilitary units, and this is unfortunately very real. And we, as one of my good friends and a very prominent poet in Russia, Maria Stepanova, just recently wrote, we all believed that we can only find portraits of those cruel warriors of the Civil War in the literature of the 20s, from 1920s. And in Babel's Red Cavalry, it's a very prominent book on the Civil War in Russia that followed the revolution. And what is stunning for us is that now we read and we see interviews from the people who represent exactly that type. People who believe in certain ideas. These ideas certainly will not be a real critique. They're very naive in their understanding of nationality, in their understanding of interests. But these are this is not a kind of local initiative that Putin initially expected. And we can see many, unfortunately, many very cruel things happening, because there are very cruel things happening now in eastern Ukraine. And those cruelties, very little of that is recorded and put onto paper. It's very dangerous now. But it's all very sad. It's a civil war. It may spread in other parts, not of Ukraine, but in other parts of Russia.
Thank you, Professor Shevelenko. This is the first time I've heard this quite dire prognosis for Russia itself. So you're suggesting that civil war of the type that we're observing in Ukraine, it's not inconceivable that could actually develop within Russia itself if things truly get as bad as they will, according to Professor Herrera's account. Given the time and the number of you out there, I had originally planned to sort of take another round of panelists, but actually what I'd like to do is open up the floor for questions now, and then I'll come back with maybe some closing remarks. So why don't we open up the floor? Yes, sir.
We just got done with a lot of polling in this country, as you know. We just got done with a lot of polling, as you know, with elections and things like that. Is it conceivable that the Russian people are ever polled as to what direction they would like to see, or is there too much fear because of the control of the government over thoughts and ideas that hinder that progress? And what do they, if they are able to do that, what do they want in terms of an economy? Do they want a change?
Well, maybe I should actually answer that because I've done a lot of survey work in Russia, but Okay. Yes, the fact is there have been public surveys of the Russian public, both by the government and by private and academic research organizations, ever since the Soviet collapse. Of late, precisely this question has been raised because the level of approval of President Putin has been exceedingly high based on the most recent poll data. Upwards of 80% of those polled in Russia say they support President Putin, and they also support the annexation of Crimea. Now, I was in Russia in August, and I can say I did some focus groups with people, everybody I talked to. Indeed, it seems quite palpable, the level of excitement and enthusiasm that the Russian people, not just in Moscow, but also in several provincial towns I visited, that there really does seem to be enthusiasm for the fact that Russia has now taken over and incorporated Crimea. And there is also a lot of public enthusiasm about Putin. So the question is, though, how deep is that? So there's one issue is, are people saying they support Putin in these polls because they're afraid if they don't say they support Putin, they might get in trouble? That's one possibility. I myself am a little bit skeptical. I think that it hasn't reached the point where Russians, most of them anyway, really fear for their personal safety if they give the wrong answer to a poll. I mean, but that's we'll never know. This is an impossible question to answer. The other question. So if there is Professor McDonald alluded to this. If it is a case that 80% of the population supports Putin, the question to me is, how deep is that support? My sense is that there is a core, solid support for Putin, maybe about 50, 60%, but that another 30 to 40% are just supporting him because, oh, well, it seems like he's doing well, there's all this excitement, there's national fervor. That could disappear very quickly. As the economic sanctions start to bite, as the initial excitement of this territorial conquest starts to wear off, there's a very tremendous possibility for a lot of discontent. Other polls about specific topics, about what should happen in Ukraine, suggest that people are not in Russia enthusiastic about Russian military troops engaging with Ukrainian troops in Ukraine. Russian mothers and fathers do not want their children to go and be killed on battlefields in Ukraine. They do not want the government to be spending money for this type of action. So this particular action, now the annexation of Crimea was very smooth, very peaceful, no Russian casualties at all to speak of. But it's going to be, potentially could be quite different if full military engagement takes place in Ukraine. So I think the polling data bear that out. So I do actually tend to trust the polls a little bit more than others do. It depends. There's some reliable companies, some government-based companies that doctor the results. And the results are, in fact, somewhat more mixed than you get just from that Putin 80% approval rating.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I agree with Ted's comments, but I think there's a little bit of a deeper philosophical issue about support for Putin, because as Irina mentioned, part of Putin's strategy is to suggest that there is no other alternative. So it's a relentless, there's no one else but Putin. And this goes back to the falsified Duma elections and then the presidential election, and this constant message that there's no other alternative than Putin. It just would be total chaos and disarray except for Putin. That message worked a little bit better when the economy was going well. But with the economy in decline, there's no other option other than Putin becomes a little bit more problematic. And also, I think Ted is exactly right that the level of support is the deepness of it is what's at stake, because there's a lot of propaganda on TV about the costs of Crimea, about the sanctions being, that is the cost of Crimea being zero, that it was a total gain, and that sanctions don't matter, and that everything is fine in Russia. And I think as the devaluation proceeds, and as other things become more visible to people, then some of that support and the idea that there was no other alternative is going to go down. The other thing is that since 2000, Putin and his team have repeatedly pledged that they would modernize the economy, that they would diversify away from oil. And what they have shown is that, A, they have not done that, and now with the declining price of oil, they're in precisely the situation they wanted to avoid, which is oil shock in an undiversified economy. So that, I think, is going to add to eventually negative impressions. But a question is how much economic decline, how long will it take to shift support?
Well, at the risk of sounding a little pessimistic, because notice the, or even more pessimistic, we're positing a causal set of mechanisms that would suggest, okay, so much popular support is lost. We don't ask ourselves, how's that going to get mobilized into action? How is that going to get mobilized at the polls or on the streets or whatever happens? And the one thing that really has concerned me since 1991 and has become, outside of the internet, which is a very interesting forum, but it seems to me has become more pronounced, is what you did in the Soviet period, and I first started going to the Soviet Union in 1975, was you were totally disengaged in public. You did the minimal interaction with state authority, you got what you needed from it, and you did not go into politics. That was a border that the people in power patrolled very fiercely, and there were big consequences for doing that. And so most of the population they understood that was part of the deal. And you're seeing, it seems to me, a similar level of disengagement. There's, which again talks about how do you convert this resentment into some sort of political action, right? Or how do you convert this strong disagreement with current policies we just saw in the polls you were talking about into some sort of organized political action? That is something, and even Ukraine shows you the difficulties of doing that. Probably the most mobilized, organized civil society in the Slavic post-Soviet space, and even there, they have proven incapable of building a coherent state in the 4 or 5 times they've had a shot since 1991. So that's one question. On the other hand, there are straws of hope. Ted referred to the discontent with the involvement in the campaign in Ukraine, and Irina quite rightly talked about sort of this slapdash nature of the intervention in Ukraine, the sort of tentativeness and hesitation to it, which I think she rightly attributes to fracture or to this set of contending factions that are all oriented around Putin. There's a very interesting woman who gave an interview yesterday in the last independent paper really left that isn't a business paper in Russia called the paper, the new paper, and she heads a body of Mothers of Soldiers, a group that has been very politically important since the Afghan War in the 1980s, and they have been unrelenting in protesting the fact that soldiers that die in southeast Ukraine do not receive any formal benefits, are buried anonymously without reference to where they served, and their families do not receive veterans benefits. And things like that might form little nuclei around which you can find the ability to actualize this discontent into something political.
So in the back.
I have actually a counterfactual question. It's a little hard to ask, but in '92, Boris Yeltsin's envoys in Brussels asked the NATO leadership if Russia could join NATO, and they were denied. Now, '92 was a period when a lot of things were possible, and if Russia sought integration with the West economically, why not seek integration with the West from the standpoint of security and military? If Russia were allowed to join NATO in '92, would it be a different country today? Would it still be a Putin's Russia today? Or, I mean, this is kind of a rhetorical question, or maybe Russia is doomed, right, to always be anti-Western, and even if it were allowed to join NATO, it would still leave NATO at some point. So my question is, if Russia joined NATO, would it be any different today or not? Thank you.
Okay, very, very interesting question. Irina, please.
Well, as literary scholar, appropriately, I can say it would have been different, but we don't know in what way. Frankly, I do not know how viable that option was from the perspective of NATO. Because that would change the agenda of that organization completely. That's a change in such a significant change in geography. It's no longer North Atlantic. It's something else. So I believe also in '92, the way Russia looked at that time to the Western partners was like nobody knew when, for example, the dissolution of this political dissolution of this space may continue. I think in '92, frankly, to me, it looked, well, I was very young at that time. To me, it looked that, I mean, it's unclear what could keep Tatarstan and Far East and all those different parts of Russia together. I still don't know how in fact, political historians explain that the dissolution of the Soviet Union did not lead at that time to further disintegration of Russia. Frankly, when I speak about disintegration of Russia and about this possibility of the civil war, this is not a scenario which I see as catastrophic. It's very bad in terms of its immediate effect. But frankly, I do not see how Russia can survive in its present shape as a political entity, being a centralized state that still tries to manage its territories as heterogeneous territories. There's a deep conflict in how Russia is governed and what Russia is. So probably regionalization, I don't know whether it's the right term, but emergence of very strong local, strong entities that will try to present themselves as new political entities within Russia is possible. And it's not bad at all. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure how to frame this, but from my point of view and my easy chair in front of the TV in Madison, Wisconsin, and just learning a little bit about what you just said and painted the picture that you just did, I'm wondering if, considering who Putin is and where he came from, and the history of Russia, if they don't feel isolated. And I think, as was stated a little bit before, their back might be against the wall. And I'm not sure, but there doesn't seem to be too many friends around that can do much good anyway. And so what do we have to do from our end of things as we here in the United States or the West, we can think about maybe putting up our own Berlin Wall. We can provide a stockade with Russia on the other side. And so how is it that we might react to this situation?
Let me reply. I think actually this question about isolation is related to NATO. NATO expansion is at the heart of most explanations in Russia for why we are where we are. I mean, just going back a little bit, Yeltsin may have sent an envoy in 1992 to ask to be joined to NATO, but what he should have done is publicly demand joining NATO, because people would have had to acknowledge that NATO is fundamentally an anti-Russian organization. I mean, the way that it was with being quiet is to say, like, oh, no, we're not really anti-Russian and we're open to this and that. But actually, if Russia had pressed publicly for that, that might have been. But why wouldn't they? Because, as Irina said, the country broke up on December 25th, 1991. Chechnya, Tatarstan, a number of other regions did not want to be part of Russia. Moreover, in Russia, there was a huge fight between Yeltsin and the communist-dominated parliament, which resulted in Yeltsin bombing the parliament in September, October 1993. So, plus the two Chechen wars. So internally within Russia, there's all this stuff going on, and externally, I think there's a lot of debate historically about, was there a promise from the United States and allies to not expand NATO if the Soviet Union pulled out of Eastern Europe. My feeling is anybody can pull out whatever documents they want, but the social fact that matters is that people in Russia believe that there was such an agreement, okay? So there's widespread belief that the US and Europe promised not to expand NATO if the Soviet Union moved out of Eastern Europe. So they feel betrayed. Now you can say, well, you know, I have the documents right here, and you're wrong about that. But that does not take away from the social support for that sense of betrayal and isolation. And so when we talk about expanding, not only having the Baltic states and other states of the former Soviet Union join the EU, but having the Baltic states join NATO, talking about Georgia joining NATO and Ukraine joining NATO. In some ways, I'm sympathetic to the argument that some Russian colleagues have made, which is to say, look, we have told you time and again that Ukraine was a red line. How many ways could we say it? We said we didn't like the Baltic states joining. We said we didn't like discussions about Georgia. And there is actually a NATO document that talks about the eventual joining of Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. Now, how many people in America know about this? No one, because we don't care about it. But people in Russia say, what about that document? And you have to say, well, it's a policy document, you know, nobody was really paying attention. But they say, look, we were like standing on the desk with our hair on fire saying, don't bother us about Ukraine because it's really important to us. And the U.S. position was like, oh yeah, well, you know, what are you going to do about it? Well, they showed who actually cares more about Ukraine. It's clear that Russia cares much more about Ukraine than we do. We are not going to send troops to Ukraine to support the Donbass. Russia may be willing to do that. So there is an asymmetry in how much we care about the region, and there was definitely miscommunication in conveying that actually Ukraine is not as important to the United States as it is to Russia, and probably the handling of the Euromaidan protests in January, some more thought should have been put into what should the U.S. position be on that emerging revolution. How would the signals by the U.S. be taken by Russians, even if we disagree with them? And, you know, how we might have averted a more aggressive situation, which is not to in any way take away the agency from Russia in the invasion of Crimea, but just to say this issue of NATO expansion is a legitimate and serious concern. The sense of isolation is serious. What people in Russia talk about is about cornered politicians. And what do you expect of a cornered politician? Do you expect reconciliation, friendliness, etc., or do you expect aggression? And that's a real problem.
If I could jump onto what you were saying, I think American policies played no small role in events in the last several years. I think it was a colossal blunder to send Michael McFaul there as ambassador. He wasn't an ambassador in the sense that the current occupant is. He was an active advocate of policies that went foursquare against Putin, which, fair enough, I can see why he would be, and he made no secret of that in his career as a scholar before that. But that's not whom you send as an ambassador to. You don't send somebody to Beijing who is going to say, well, let Hong Kong go and go stand alongside the protesters in Hong Kong, or go to Taiwan and say, we really need to get you some nukes, protect you from. Now, McFaul wasn't quite that virulent, but two people, I'm sure, in the State Department must have known how sensitive certain issues were. And you're probably never going to get trust, but there's a certain level on which you have to speak seriously with serious interlocutors. Now, on isolation, people on either side of Putin's retinue would say, well, it's too bad. One side, the more liberally inclined, would say, well, it's very unfortunate we're losing these market opportunities in the West. And yes, Professor Herrera is quite right about this, but we're about the closing off and the deleterious effects of the evaporation of investment capital from the West. However, we've got this neighbor to the southeast that is just overflowing with money, and we'll sell them our natural resources. Now, it doesn't solve the resource economy problem, but it gives us, and the Russians are not alone in investing great hopes in the future profitability of the Chinese capital and consumer markets. And then due south of them, there's this country called Turkey, which has also got its own political and economic potential and its own big discontents with the conventional power bloc in NATO. Then there's this place, India, which also has 1 billion plus consumers with whom Russia has traditionally very good relations. So that's part of why you're hearing some of these new ideologies from seemingly high-placed circles about that Irina quite rightly called naive, the Eurasian, well, this very vulgar form of what was once called Eurasianism, and this idea that we're not European. I don't think there's a Russian who can read without moving her lips that believes that, but nonetheless, it's getting good place. So they're not as isolated as we would like to think, but on the other hand, what can we do about it? I think Yoi's right. We've got limited options. I think we just have to defend the people that are in NATO and figure out something with the Ukrainians to help them help themselves.
Thank you. So just on that point quickly, then I want to recognize the patient gentleman in the second row. How many people in this room know what the BRICS are?
Yeah.
No, pretty impressive. Well, how many Americans do you think have heard of the BRICS? Well, the BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and they're supposedly new regional. Well, South Africa is sort of, some people include that as the S. It's actually, the concept came out of Goldman Sachs report some years back, which said that these are rising powers and they're going to be working together. Well, in Russia right now, that concept is on the tip of everybody's tongue, even in the general population, because the Russian government has been saying, look, now we're going to throw our hat in with China. Brazil loves us. You know, Putin was on his way back from Brazil when ostensibly the United States tried to shoot down his plane and instead hit that poor Malaysian, or it was the Ukrainian government, I guess, with the United States support. But the point is that, yeah, indeed, Russia itself is conscientiously trying to move away, to pivot, so to speak, to use a recently popular term, away from the West and towards Asia and its potential partners there. Okay, so, sir, the second row, please.
We were also in Russia this August, and going from the very far east to Moscow is truly a journey in two different worlds, or half a dozen, yeah.
Wow.
But the people we talked to in the east, the ethnic Russians and the train crew, they constantly seem to allude to the fact that it's those ethnic Russians out west, it's their problem. They didn't identify with the Crimea and the issues. They seemed to be okay in those spots where there were like oil patches and they had money from the oil economy, but they're so distantly related to what's happening, or unrelated, distancing themselves from what's going on in Moscow, that if the economy keeps getting worse, you know, they're basically going to say, who are these people? I mean, 8 or 9 time zones, it's just, how do you govern that? Because they haven't put any infrastructure in there to say that it's worthwhile sticking with these guys. That's the point that you made, that, you know, how can they hold this colossus together?
Right, absolutely. And 100 years ago, during the Civil War, we saw essentially the beginning of this dissolution, disintegration of Russia as a political space. And after, still after 1922, the central government was able to sort of bring back, including the Far East, bring back those regions under this under its own governance. In fact, it would be a good question to ask: what if that wouldn't happen? What if the Civil War would actually bring to this political disintegration of the space? It's not unthinkable, in fact. It's not a question that, it's not something that could not have happened at all, like zero probability. It could have happened. Well, now we're facing, there are preconditions, and there's no certainty. There's probably less than 50% of certainty that something along those lines may happen, because Russia, in the course of the 20th century, despite policies of the Soviet state that tried to integrate that nation that was Soviet people, as they came up with this word for all the people in the Soviet Union to say, well, we actually have a nation state. Russia is not a nation state. And what you see, talking to people in the Far East who are ethnic Russians, but who do not have that sense of belonging to that common political entity. Even more, I would expect that if things will go really bad with the Ukrainian war, and that's the probability is higher than 50% that something will be happening, will be unfolding there during the winter. Some regions will say, Tatarstan, for example, we have nothing to do with it. We don't care about Russian world. We are Tatars. And Bashkirs can say the same. In central Russia, in fact, there are a lot of regions where you have significant concentration of non-Russian population, historically. And in the Far East, in Siberia, they will say, well, we are Russians, but Crimea is so far away, like Australia may be close to us. So, or Japan definitely, or China. So there are all preconditions for that political disintegration in there. Again, it doesn't mean that it will happen in this century, but maybe, yeah.
I want to depart from my pessimism so far and say I actually think that scenario. I agree with Irina and the comment that there are ethnic, regional, and identity differences for sure. But this is one area where I think there is very little likelihood of Russia as a state breaking up. Why? Because they've already played that song. They have had a lot of not just debates about federalism and disintegration, but they had an extremely violent war in Chechnya 2 times, which is the state region in the south that did want to break away. And the lesson to all regional leaders at the time is that you have a central government that's willing to use unlimited force to absolutely decimate a territory to keep it as part of Russia. It's a lesson. Now, maybe you could say, well, okay, it was 1994 and 1999, like maybe they have forgotten about it. But institutionally, there's a lot of work institutionally that Putin has done in the last 14 years to shore up the centralized institutional structure of the federation, including putting his people in as governors, getting rid of regional parties. There's a lot of things that existed in the 90s that just do not exist today. So if you really wanted to have a separatist movement in Siberia or in Yakutsk or in any of these places, you don't have any of the political institutional infrastructure for mobilization of that kind of sentiment. So I think the only scenario that I think could really happen is if in the most remote scenario there's some sort of revolutionary situation in Moscow and there's extreme level of chaos or anarchy in the center, that would provide an opening for some regional disintegration. But short of that, I don't see regions, despite their identity differences, regions being the engine of that kind of disintegration, just because of the institutional factors mainly.
Okay, thank you. We are, in fact, out of time. But before I let you go, oh, do we have?
No, nothing.
Oh,
No,
does it go at 2:30?
Yep.
Okay. Oh, so before I let you go, then I have 2 quick things I want to say. First of all, I direct a center called the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia on campus, of which our panelists are all members. And Wisconsin is especially strong. I actually think, honestly, in my objective opinion, it's the leading United States university in terms of the concentration of faculty experts on this part of the world. And we all work through the center. Our center has a weekly lecture series. If you're interested in Russia, in Eastern Europe, in Central Asia, in this part of the world, please check out our website. We go by CREECA as our acronym, and our Thursday lectures are open to the public. Secondly, and a final parting thought, and that is we've heard a lot of very pessimistic views today and very dire predictions. We did get some disagreement there at the end, which is always nice to see on a panel discussion. I just want to point out that taking seriously the idea that we don't know what's going to happen, that there are some grounds to be cautious before embracing the likelihood of these nightmarish scenarios. We have seen a lot of this before. Russia has experienced very severe economic crises in the last decade. In 2008, things were very bad as they were in this country. We've seen crackdowns on civil society, on dissident views. We've seen Russia invade other countries as recently as 2008. And so all these things have happened before. Things are bad now. But and I'm not an optimist myself by any means. I just want to remind us that we don't really know what's going to happen, and it is possible that somehow or other Russia will muddle through this situation, and somehow or other things will more or less become normalized again. Thank you very much.